Hi, my name is John, and I was a long-distance truck driver for over a decade. The road took its toll on me. The countless miles weighed heavily on me, and the constant hum of the engine seeped into my bones, leaving a weariness that I could no longer ignore. I knew that I needed a change, something that would allow me to break free from the monotonous cycle of endless highways. So I decided to hang up my trucker hat, and I began scouring the internet for a new job. After a bit of looking around and sifting through countless job listings, I came across an interesting position as a night security guard at an ice machine company. The company's headquarters were fairly large, with an office building and an attached warehouse. This piqued my interest, so I sent in my resume. A few days later, they called me back and we set up an interview. So, a few days later, I drove to the interview, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I arrived a bit early, but the head of security, a gruff middle-aged man named Frank, greeted me with a firm handshake and escorted me to his small, cluttered office. He asked me about my experience and my background, and as I shared tales from my time on the road, his eyes locked onto mine, giving me his full attention. "So, you've seen a lot of things on the road," he said. "Yes, I have, Frank," I said. I began reminiscing about the time just a few weeks ago that I had narrowly avoided a deer darting across a highway. I wrapped up that story and we talked a bit more about what I had done. Finally, I said, "Well, I've learned to stay alert, and even when things get quiet, I think that I'd be a good fit here." Frank nodded as I spoke, occasionally jotting down notes on a small pad of paper. He leaned back in his chair, and after a moment of contemplation, he said, "I think you're well suited for this job, John. We need someone who can handle the solitude and the responsibility of watching the building at night. If you're up for it, the job's yours." I accepted the offer without hesitation, slightly shocked at how easy it had been to get it. A change of scenery and a steady schedule sounded like the perfect way to start anew. "All right then, you can start tomorrow," Frank said. We shook hands and Frank told me to come in early the following day for a brief training session and to meet with HR. The next day, as instructed, I arrived early at the company, well before my shift was scheduled to start. The building was a mix of brick and steel with the company's logo emblazoned on the side. Frank once again greeted me at the door and handed me a security badge with my name and photo on it, and he began showing me around the building. As we walked, Frank pointed out the various security measures in place, including security cameras, motion detectors, and a state-of-the-art alarm system. "You'll be responsible for monitoring these systems, as well as doing regular patrols of the building and the warehouse," he explained, tapping a finger against a camera. "Oh, and don't forget to keep an eye on the cleaning crew that comes in at night." As we continued our tour, we passed a few employees who were still finishing up their work for the day. Everyone seemed friendly, and I started to feel optimistic about my new job. Finally, Frank led me to the small security office where I would be spending most of my time. The room had a desk, a couple of chairs, and a wall full of monitors displaying live feeds from the security cameras, casting a greenish glow across the room. Frank handed me a set of keys. "These are your master keys," he said, his voice stern and serious. "They'll open every door in the building. Be careful with them and don't lose them under any circumstances." "I understand, Frank. I'll keep them safe," I assured him, feeling the weight of the responsibility settling on my shoulders. Frank nodded, satisfied with my response. "Okay, I'm heading home now, but I'll see you tomorrow morning. Good luck, and don't hesitate to call me if you need anything." And with that, I was left alone to watch the building. As the door closed behind Frank, I couldn't help but feel a slight chill run down my spine. I shook off the eerie sensation, just chalking it up to nerves. Then I settled into my chair, ready to face the night. I sat in the office for a while, and eventually I started feeling a bit more comfortable in my new surroundings. I decided that it was probably best to start my first night as a night security guard by doing my rounds. The dim overhead lights cast long shadows across the hallways as I moved through the office. I meticulously checked each door and window to ensure that everything was as it should be. By now, most of the employees had already gone home, leaving behind an eerie silence that hung heavily in the air. The building became a sort of liminal space when it was completely empty. But in a way, it was cozy. It was comfortable, but still a little disconcerting. As I entered the warehouse, I noticed the hum of machinery and the faint sound of someone working in the distance. As I walked further inside, I saw that it was a tall, wiry man who was busy organizing crates. "Hey, I'm the new night security guard," I introduced myself, extending my hand. "I'm John, what's your name?" The man looked up from his work and wiped his brow. "Hey there, I'm Tom," he replied, shaking my hand firmly. "I'll be here for a while, just finishing up some work. Don't mind me," he said. "No problem, Tom," I said with a friendly smile. "I'll just continue my patrol. If you need anything, just let me know." "Will do," he replied. And so I continued my patrol, making sure that all of the exits were secured and noting the placement of fire extinguishers and emergency exits. As I checked the doors that led from the warehouse to the office area, I noticed papers sticking up from behind the crash bar. I pulled on it and discovered that there were dozens of small packets of table salt. Odd, I thought. But since it didn't affect the security of the building, I decided that it wasn't my problem. I finished up patrolling the building and, satisfied that everything was in order, I grabbed a coffee from the break room and headed back to my office. As I settled into my chair, I familiarized myself with the security camera system, paying close attention to their coverage areas and making a mental note of any potential blind spots. Now, feeling somewhat settled, I put in my earbuds and I turned on a true crime podcast and then focused on the cameras. Time passed uneventfully, and I was starting to feel a bit bored when Tom, the warehouse worker, startled me. He had come by to let me know that he was leaving. "Hey, John, I'm heading out," Tom said. "I'll make sure that the warehouse is locked up before I go." I nodded acknowledgement and thanked him for the heads up. He turned to leave, but paused. He turned back. "Good luck," he said. He looked like he was about to say something else, but then he just turned and left. I watched him on the cameras, locking the warehouse doors before finally leaving the premises. A few minutes later, the cleaning crew arrived and I let them in before ensuring that the entrance was locked behind them. I returned to my desk and I watched as they moved efficiently through the offices. After a few minutes of this, I decided that it was a great time for my next patrol. Leaving the security office, I walked through the building again, listening to the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the quiet halls. I double-checked the doors and the windows, finding them all securely locked, and I made a mental note of the cleaning crew's whereabouts. One of the cleaners, a woman, was diligently vacuuming a large open office area, while the other, a young man, was carefully cleaning the glass walls of the second-story conference room. Feeling satisfied that everything was under control, I returned to my desk and I resumed watching the cameras and listening to my podcast. As the night wore on, nothing extraordinary happened. I continued to watch the cameras and I continued to listen to my podcasts. I started fighting off bouts of drowsiness as I waited for the hours to pass, and for the first light of dawn to break through the darkness. After a while, the cleaning crew finished their work and the woman came by my office to get me to lock the doors behind them. "By the way, my name's Maria," she said. I introduced myself. We chatted as we headed down the hall and into the lobby. I unlocked the door and I held it open for them. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said with a smile. "Oh, hey, by the way," I called after them. "What's with all the salt packets in all the doors?" Maria turned back and said, "I don't know. They've been here since I started." "Oh, okay," I replied. I waved goodbye and then I locked the doors behind them. Then I went and performed another thorough patrol of the building. Once again, everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. I had been watching the cameras for about 2 hours, and despite the fascinating stories from the podcast, I could feel my eyelids beginning to grow heavy. I had done my patrol as I was supposed to, actually more than I was supposed to. But the stillness of the night and the repetitive nature of my task, well, they were beginning to take a toll. I was desperate for a jolt of energy, so I got up and I went to grab a cup of coffee. I walked into the break room and I noticed the clock on the wall. It was nearly 3 a.m., the infamous witching hour, the time when supernatural events were said to be at their peak. I shivered involuntarily and I poured myself a cup of strong black coffee, adding a splash of creamer to offset the bitterness. I took a deep breath, inhaling the rich aroma, and I hoped that the caffeine would keep me awake for the remaining hours of my shift. As I returned to my desk, I glanced at the cameras and I saw something flash on the screen for just a split second. It had almost looked like a figure walking down the third-floor hall. But the hall was empty now, and there were no doors anywhere near where the figure had seemed to be. I blinked and I rubbed my eyes. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. "It's just my mind playing tricks on me," I muttered under my breath. But an eerie sensation lingered, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I shook my head, trying to dispel the feeling, and I took a long sip of my coffee. As I walked through the darkened offices and silent hallways, illuminated only by the dim glow of the emergency lighting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But everything seemed to be in order. My footsteps echoing in the empty building, the only sound I heard. So I returned to my post. About an hour later, I decided that I should go and do another patrol. Both because it was assigned and because it was the most interesting thing that I could actually do, I had determined. So, fulfilling my duty and taming my boredom, I walked through the building. I made a mental checklist confirming once again that every door and every window was locked. I smiled to myself, thinking how easy this job was, albeit it was a bit monotonous and it was definitely boring. But it was still easy, and way better than driving a truck. Before I headed back to my desk, I decided that I wanted to get another cup of coffee. I still had a fair bit to go in what was turning out to be a long night, and I needed all the energy that I could get. As I poured myself a cup, I thought that I heard a faint whisper coming from the direction of the warehouse. I paused for a moment and I listened intently, my pulse quickening slightly. I didn't hear anything else. I dismissed it as just my imagination running wild, fueled by my fatigue, and I returned once again to my desk, sipping on my coffee. The rest of the night was mostly uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. I thought that I heard the whispering a few more times, and a couple of times while I was patrolling, I thought that I saw shadows flicker out of the corner of my eye. But each time when I looked, there was nothing there. I continued trying to reassure myself, saying things like, "It's just the late hour," or "You're just adjusting to the new job." But my mind kept returning to the fleeting image that I had seen on the security camera, and to the mysterious whispers. Once the sky began to lighten, heralding the approach of dawn, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and lingering unease. My first night as a security guard was over and had been pretty much ordinary. But I just couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, just waiting to reveal itself. The next night started off pretty much like the first. I arrived and patrolled the building, let the cleaners in, I watched the cameras, etc. Nothing weird happened. I began to feel the slight unease that I had had all day slip away. After a few hours, the cleaning crew stopped by the office and I went to lock the door after them. As I was letting the cleaning crew out, we stopped and talked for a bit, discussing our plans for the weekend. Maria, a cheerful woman in her late 30s, mentioned that she was going to a concert on Saturday. "I've been looking forward to this for months," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'm just planning on catching up on sleep," I replied, laughing. "It's been a long week adjusting to this new job." We said goodbye and they headed out, and I started to lock the doors when Maria suddenly stopped and ran back towards the building. I reopened the door and she said that she had just realized that she had forgotten her phone. I let her back in and I offered to go with her to help her find it. "The last time I used it, I think that I was on the second floor in the conference room," Maria said. We climbed the dimly lit stairs, the soft hum of the building's ventilation system surrounding us. The air felt heavy and still, with a faint smell of dampness lingering in the halls. As we entered the conference room, the pale moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting elongated shadows across the floor. Maria's phone was on the conference table, nestled between stacks of papers and a box of whiteboard markers. She chuckled nervously and thanked me for helping her. "I don't know what I would have done without it," she admitted, holding the phone close to her chest. "Thanks for helping me find it." "No problem, Maria," I reassured her. "I'm glad I could help." "Oh, and I removed some of those salt packets that were wedged into the doors," she said. "I couldn't get them all. I'll try to get the rest tomorrow night." "Oh, great," I said. "I didn't mean to cause you any more work. I was just curious about why they were there." "It's no problem. I really should have gotten rid of them sooner," she replied. I walked her out to her car and wished her goodbye, then returned to the building and locked the doors. I then performed another patrol before returning to my desk, hoping for an uneventful night. The silence of the empty offices felt oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the night wore on, I kept a watchful eye on the cameras. The podcast that I was listening to was discussing eerie urban legends, which only added to my growing sense of unease. At some point, I noticed a flickering light on one of the screens. It was coming from the second-floor conference room where we had found Maria's phone earlier. I observed the situation for a moment, trying to decide whether or not I should investigate it or just dismiss it as a glitch in the system. Deciding that it was best to check it out, I made my way to the second floor, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I climbed the stairs. The once muted sounds of my footsteps now seemed to echo loudly through the empty corridors. As I reached the second floor, I saw that the door to the conference room was wide open. I furrowed my brow, recalling that I had closed it when Maria and I left. I cautiously approached, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I slowly pushed the door to the room open, my hand trembling as the lights flickered on and off. I checked the light switch, but it seemed to be functioning normally. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the flickering stopped, leaving me in the darkness of the room. Only my flashlight prevented the darkness from completely engulfing me. As I was about to leave the room, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the glass wall at the far end of the room. I slowly walked over, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew closer, the temperature of the room suddenly seemed to drop. I could now see my breath in the air. A whispering voice echoed through the room, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't make out the words it was saying. I reached the window and all the sounds stopped. I used my flashlight to look into the hall on the other side of the glass wall. The hall was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing that could have been making the tapping or the whispering. Then I looked closer and I saw the reflection of a shadowy figure in the glass. My heart raced as I whipped around, but there was no one behind me. I tried to steady my breathing, feeling increasingly unsettled. I left the room, making sure to close the door. Despite my growing unease, I decided to finish my patrol, hoping that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I checked the remaining offices on the second floor, but everything seemed normal. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and my own footsteps echoing through the hallways. I returned to my desk, my nerves on edge, and I tried to focus on the cameras. As the night continued, the strange occurrences persisted. Flickering lights, unexplained noises, and shadowy figures lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, and I longed for the safety of the daylight. Slowly but surely, the clock ticked closer to dawn. As I continued to monitor the cameras, the darkness of the building seemed to seep into every corner of the screen. The tension in the air was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My heart raced as I noticed something unusual on the camera in the main open office area. A shadowy figure flickered in and out of view. The whispers that had been haunting me all night seemed to grow louder, echoing through the halls as if they were coming from every direction at once. It felt as if they were closing in on me, surrounding me with their eerie, unintelligible murmurs. Summoning my courage, I decided to investigate the open office area. As I approached the location, the whispers grew more insistent, their ghostly voices sending chills down my spine. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I searched the office, my flashlight casting trembling beams of light through the darkness. The desks and the chairs seemed untouched, and nothing appeared to be out of place. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a low, guttural growl coming from the hallway. The incoherent whispers coalesced into some sort of chant. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a primal fear take hold of me. I stepped out into the hallway, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead. At the far end of the corridor, a dark, hulking figure stood, its shape indistinct and constantly shifting. My blood ran cold as I realized that this was the source of the malevolent presence that had been plaguing me all night. I rose in fear as the figure slowly moved towards me, its form growing larger and more menacing with each step. It was as if the darkness itself was reaching out to engulf me. Somehow, I managed to snap out of my paralysis and I ran towards the stairwell, bolting down the stairs and back to my desk. I frantically called the police, my voice trembling as I relayed my experience. The dispatcher instantly recognized the address and said that they would send officers right away. Thinking back now, I'm a bit surprised at how quickly the dispatcher had gotten the address. It was as if they had expected it. Maybe they just had caller ID or something like that, but there seemed to be more to it. As if they almost expected it and it was a regular occurrence. Anyway, I waited, my eyes glued to the cameras, praying for help to arrive. But after over 2 agonizing hours, they still hadn't come. And I realized with a sinking feeling that they probably weren't going to. After what I had seen and everything that I had experienced, I was now convinced that something supernatural was happening at the building. Desperate for guidance and reassurance, I called Frank, my supervisor. I realized that I probably should have done that earlier, but my mind was just not clear. He picked up groggily and said hello. I quickly explained the terrifying events of the night, but he dismissed my concerns as just paranoia, and he told me to stay focused on the job. "You're just letting your imagination get the best of you," he said, his voice cold and unsympathetic. Feeling helpless and abandoned, I stayed at my desk for the rest of the night. The whispers persisted, accompanied by other chilling sounds. Footsteps echoing in empty hallways, distant laughter, and the creaking of doors opening and closing on their own. I caught glimpses of shadowy figures on the cameras, but I didn't dare go to investigate anything any further. Finally, the dawn arrived. I waited for Frank to arrive, but he was uncharacteristically late. Exhausted and frightened, I decided to go home and I would call him later. Once home, I called the office, but Frank still wasn't there. Unable to shake the night's terror, but completely exhausted, I climbed into bed, hoping to get some sleep before my next shift. I knew that I needed answers, but more importantly, I needed to find the strength to face another night in that building. I made up my mind to get some sleep and then to go in early that evening to talk to Frank. I slept fitfully, finally getting to sleep just in time for the alarm to wake me. Not really wanting to, but knowing that I had to, I forced myself out of bed and I headed in early as I had planned. My heart was heavy with a sense of foreboding. Hopefully, a face-to-face talk with Frank about the chilling events that had transpired the previous night would help, somehow. When I arrived, the cheerful receptionist gave me unsettling news. Frank hadn't come in that day due to a family emergency. I debated just leaving, but I needed the job. So I reluctantly decided to stay. As I sat waiting for my shift to start, I made a decision that after the cleaning crew left, I would only patrol the first floor, since the only odd occurrences that had happened there were the whispering and a few unexplained noises. The figure, which was the most concerning thing that had happened, had only appeared on the second and the third floors. Never on the first floor and never in the warehouse. So, theoretically, those areas should be safe. I also decided that I would wedge all of the doors that gave access to the first floor from the floors above. That might keep me safe, right? I mean, if the figure wanted to get to me, it would have to use the elevator, and I would hear the bell. Now, I know that this logic is faulty since it's pretty clear that the figure didn't seem to be bound by the laws of physics. But it was enough to let me gather a little courage so that I could stay. I went to the security room and I watched on the cameras as the employees went home for the night. A sense of impending doom settled over me as the night began. I ran through the same routine that I had developed the previous nights, watching the cameras and listening to my podcast. This time I chose comedy podcasts. Hopefully that would give me a better mindset. After a while, I saw the cleaning crew arrived. I went and I let them in, and after chatting briefly with Maria, I went back to my desk. Looking at the warehouse cameras, I realized that Tom was still there. Feeling a desperate need for answers, I decided to go and ask him about the horrifying events I had experienced the night before. Maybe he could shed some light on what was happening. I found Tom just as he was getting ready to leave. I told him briefly about the events of the last few nights, and I asked him if he knew anything about what was going on. He appeared uneasy and oddly cryptic, as if he wanted to avoid discussing the subject altogether. But I could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes, hinting that he knew something about the sinister presence in the building. I pressed him for answers, but Tom remained tight-lipped, refusing to delve into the matter further. He wished me luck again and hurriedly left the building. I returned to my desk and I watched the cleaning crew go through the building. To my relief, nothing strange happened during their time there. As they began to finish up, I decided to patrol the building one more time while they were still there, since nothing seemed to happen until they left. But as I conducted the patrol, the whispers returned, their faint, eerie voices sending chills down my spine once again. As I passed the main office areas, I heard vacuuming, but the whispers were still clearly audible. I headed into the office area and I saw Maria working there. She looked up at me and smiled. I asked Maria if she could hear the unsettling sounds, but she shook her head, clearly puzzled by my question. Now, completely unnerved, I quickly finished my patrol, thoroughly checking all the doors and windows, ensuring that they were locked. With a growing sense of dread, I went to the break room and I poured myself 6 cups of coffee, intending to not leave my desk all night. It took me 3 trips to carry all of the coffee back to my desk. As I was bringing in the last 2 cups, the cleaners were getting ready to head out and had dropped by the office. Maria noticed the array of coffee cups and chuckled, making a lighthearted joke about my caffeine consumption. I forced a smile, let them out, and I locked up. Then I quickly went and wedged all the doors, barring access to the first floor from above. Returning to my desk, I settled in, sipping my coffee and keeping a vigilant eye on the cameras. To distract myself, I put my earbuds in and I started listening to another podcast, hoping to pass the time with some semblance of normalcy. Hours ticked by. Nothing unusual occurred. Slowly, I began to feel more at ease, thinking that perhaps it had all been a figment of my imagination. As the night went on, though, I became more and more alert, feeling the effects of the caffeine. Suddenly, my heart lurched as I spotted a figure standing in the hallway on the second floor, captured by one of the cameras. The figure was facing the camera, its dark, shadowy form seemingly staring right at me. In an instant, the figure disappeared. Panicking, I remembered my decision to stay on the first floor. I tried to calm myself down, reminding myself that most of the strange incidents had occurred on the second and third floors, and the figure had never appeared on the main floor. There was no way anything could get to me since I had wedged all the doors that would allow access to the first floor. Gripping my coffee cup tightly, I continued to watch the cameras, my paranoia intensifying with each passing moment. The air felt heavy and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring against me. The silence of the building was deafening, amplifying every little sound and feeding my growing anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me, that the dark entity was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Time seemed to drag on, and I struggled to keep my thoughts from spiraling out of control. In an effort to distract myself, I started browsing through my phone, searching for anything that might help explain the terrifying phenomena that I was experiencing. As I scrolled through the articles and the forums on the supernatural, I stumbled across stories of people who had encountered malevolent spirits and how they had managed to protect themselves using various methods, such as salt, sage, and prayer. My pulse quickened as I realized that the line between reality and the supernatural was becoming increasingly blurred for me. I knew that I had to do something to protect myself, but with limited resources at my disposal, my options were very limited. Desperate, I searched the first floor of the building for anything that might offer some semblance of protection. Finally, in the break room, I found several containers of salt. Summoning all the bravery I could muster, I raced to all the doors that I had wedged, and I poured a line of salt in front of each one. Maybe that, along with the wedges, could contain whatever I was facing. I then went to my office and I locked the door behind me. Then I decided to create a circle of salt around my desk, hoping that the age-old belief in its protective properties held some truth. Then, after creating the salt circle, I returned to my chair and I tried to steady my breathing. For a while, everything remained calm. However, my fragile sense of safety was shattered when the whispers returned, this time louder and more menacing than ever before. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white as I strained to make out the words being whispered. The whispers seemed to taunt me, their eerie voices circling around me like a sinister chorus. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, casting ominous shadows on the wall. I could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, feeding off my fear. As the hours ticked by, I noticed the figure appeared and disappeared on the cameras multiple times, each time in a different location. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. It appeared more and more frequently, but it still seemed to be isolated to the second and third floors. It wasn't trying to get past the wedged and lightly salted doors. I tried to ignore it and focus on my podcast, but the fear was overwhelming. The air around me continued to grow colder. Goosebumps erupted on my skin, and I struggled to maintain my composure. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash, and quickly I checked the cameras to try and locate it. The door to the back stairwell was now open. The salt, however, was still in place. I quickly scanned the other cameras covering the area, trying to see if the figure was now on the first floor. An unearthly scream rang through the building, and I quickly looked back to the camera covering the back stair doors. To my horror, I saw the line of salt was disrupted. It looked as if it had exploded outwards from the stairwell. I realized that the shadow figure must have tried to cross it. The scream must have been from it. I didn't see the figure on any of the other cameras. Maybe the figure had been destroyed, I thought. But what if it hadn't? Well, now the salt line was disrupted, and there was nothing between me and the figure but the salt circle around my desk. And if it could get through one salt line, well, it could probably get through another. I had to do something. The whispers returned. This time they were louder and more insistent. The whispers seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding me and making it impossible to pinpoint a source. They sounded angry and almost seemed to be chanting. I started to feel dizzy and disorientated from the overwhelming cacophony of voices. I knew I had to do something before I passed out. I quickly glanced at the cameras. I was not prepared for what I saw. The figure was there again. This time it was standing on the first floor. Standing in the hall outside the stairwell doors, staring directly at the camera. Paralyzed with fear, I watched as the figure slowly moved down the hallway. I knew that I couldn't stay any longer. There was nothing that could stop it. So I made the decision to leave the building. I grabbed the remaining 2 salt canisters and ran out of the security office, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I sprinted down the hall and crashed through the doors into the lobby. As I did, the figure emerged from the doors at the back of the lobby. It flew towards me, screeching. I popped open the salt canisters and I flung salt at it. The figure was less than 6 feet from me as the salt hit it. It acted as if it had been hit by a truck and flew backwards. It stopped moving and seemed to glare at me. The figure almost appeared to be flickering, but it became solid once again and then slowly began moving towards me. The whispers resumed their chanting. I looked down at the salt canisters in my hand. They were now empty. I dropped them and I raced past the glass wall and out the front doors, not stopping to lock them behind me. I ran as fast as I could to my car. I got in, I started it, and I sped away from the building. As I flew out of the parking lot, I glanced back. I could see the figure standing right behind the main doors. There now seemed to be some sort of odd glow coming from the building. I slammed my foot down on the gas and sped away. After I had driven several miles, I decided that I was probably safe. I pulled over and I caught my breath, my hands still shaking. I pulled my phone from my pocket and I called Frank. I explained what had happened, insisting that I would not be returning to the building. I don't know if he believed me, and I really don't care. I knew what I saw. I know what happened, and I swore that I would never set foot in that building again. Anyway, I found a new job. I never learned the true nature of the supernatural events that occurred during my time as a night security guard. I suspect that Tom and maybe some of the other employees had been placing all those salt packets on the doors. That must have had something to do with why the figure had been confined on the first few nights. But that's just a theory. The whole thing is really still just a big mystery. And to be honest, I don't really care if I ever get all the answers. It's okay that some things just can't be explained.